All right, welcome back to Module 1.2.2. We're just going to kind of retouch over plant reproduction because remember that the vegetative growth is ultimately getting that plant to that reproductive stage so that it can produce a seed primarily to continue on the lineage of that plant. But remember that that seed is what we are actually going to use in order for food and processing so that we can have more food for ourselves, or most likely we're going to feed it to animals. And having an understanding of the different types of plants and how they perform, kind of a retouch from plant science, helps us understand. I think most of this is going to be directed towards plant breeding. I'm setting this up for plant breeding and understanding that. All right, so previously we talked about there are different types of stems and modified stems, and these are going to be our asexually reproduced crops. So there is not going to be a lot of genetic variation that occurs naturally in these particular crops. We literally, physically, intentionally have to breed them. And for our stolons and our rhizomes, if you take me for turf management, we'll be talking about some of these different grasses, and they are typically not grown out to seed because this process is very difficult. It's easier to just use the stolons and the rhizomes and get sod in order to repopulate or in order to sod an area. So for our sexual reproduction, this is going to be the pollen actually fertilizing the egg in the ovary. So the primary function of the flower is to produce the seed. And because it produces that seed, and there are different components of a fruit that have that seed in there, we're able to have other crops that also serve as food. But this is where that genetic information is going to be stored for germination. So as we looked at the parts of the seed, this is where the genetic information is going to be in there in the endosperm. And if you take a seed physiology course, which we do not offer one here, it really goes and breaks down into that. And what happens when you actually imbibe that water and the processes that go on there. But for the most part, we're going to use that seed for human and animal consumption. And so we have three different types of pollination. We have self-pollinated, where those genetics are maintained. You have to think about this, that if you only receive your own pollen, then you would not get any genetic variation because you're basically just recycling your genetics. So if you have poor genetics, or this plant, I'm saying you as a human, but you got to think about that if a plant has poor genetics, eventually it will die because it will not produce offspring that are going to be viable. We call that inbreeding depression. Next, we have often cross-pollinated. So it has the potential to be self-pollinated, but for the most part, it is cross-pollinated. It prefers to have some outside pollen source, and outside being from a different plant. Hopefully that different plant has some genetic variation in it such that we get that hybrid vigor. And then naturally cross-pollinated. This means that it requires genetic variation. I guess in the sense of plant breeding, that there are certain mechanisms on that pollen grain that tell the plant whether it is from me. Again, I'm trying to use humans and plants. There are certain mechanisms and certain chemicals that plant produces. And if that pollen grain falls back into the ovary, if that egg gets fertilized by its own pollen, that egg will abort because it knows that it's from itself. And we call that self sterility. All right, so going back to plant science, there are perfect and imperfect flower parts. So if a plant is perfect, or a flower is perfect, it has both male and female flower parts. It is imperfect if it has either or. Just as so I'm going to set this up. This is just the flower. Now the location of that flower on the plant, if a plant has both male and female flowers on itself, which is going to be most crops, then it is monoecious. I can hear my major professor, Ishi, meaning house. Monoecious, monoecious, one house. Or we have dioecious. The plant has either or, but not both. So the plant has a male flower, but not a female, or a female flower, but not a male flower. This is important because if you buy a whole bunch of plants and you think they're just going to cross pollinate, but they're all males, that's not going to happen. Probably the most notable dioecious plant is the ginkgo. And you need to buy a male ginkgo tree or a female ginkgo tree in order, well, you need to buy a male and a female in order to continue producing more ginkgo trees. Next, for that flower, we have incomplete and complete. So a complete flower has four main parts: the sepals, the petals, the stamen, and the carpel. In the stamen, we have the anther and the filament. So the filament is going to be this cylindrical rod, or kind of looks like a stem that is going to hold up that pollen head or the anther. So you might hear the term anthesis, and that is when the pollen grain is ready to detach from the anther, fall onto a stigma, move down into the ovule, and fertilize these eggs. Next, we have the carpel, which is the female part. You may have heard this as the pistil. They're both the same thing. And in that carpel or pistil, we have the stigma, the style, the ovary, and then the ovule. So the pollen grain, this is in a self-pollinating flower. That pollen grain will land on the stigma, or could be from another flower, depending. Bees and other pollinators may move from flower to flower. Moves down the style into the ovary and fertilizes the egg in the ovule. Now, if you take crop production, if you take crop improvement, we kind of go a little bit more into the genetics of that and what that actual process is. I mean, we might see that at the end of this particular module. There's a graphic that I can kind of walk through. So complete has all four parts: sepal, petal, stamen, carpel or pistil. So perfect flowers have the stamen and the carpel in the same flower. They are often self-pollinated and their genetics are unchanged. The most common one being soybean. Has all 4 parts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next, we have incomplete flowers. They have either the stamen or the carpel, and they are often cross-pollinated. And these plants can be either monoecious or dioecious. Now, it is possible to be monoecious complete, which would then make it perfect. It is possible to be monoecious and incomplete. It is possible to be monoecious and perfect, but incomplete. Make sure I'm saying that right. It is possible to be monoecious, and if it's imperfect, that makes it incomplete. So if it's imperfect, it's automatically by default incomplete because it is missing one of these 2 things. Or one of those 4 things, technically. All right, so corn's a really good example of how we can have all of these things together and it still be like, wait a minute, what is this? So we have a male flower, or the male part of the flower, a flower with a male part, known as the tassel. This is where the pollen is. So that pollen will now fall down onto the carpel, or the female portion of that plant, or the female flower. And the silk is actually the pollen tube that pollen needs to grow down. And then it fertilizes the egg inside of that little corn ear leaf, and then it will start to grow and reproduce all of these different seeds. So each one of those little stringy things, the silks that you pull out of those, every seed on that ear of corn has a silk associated with it. One of the problems with corn plants is that this is not timed very well. So the female flower will bloom, air quote, not that it'll bloom, but it will be formed first. And there's a clock that ticks with that, where there's a window that pollen tube needs, or the ovule needs to be fertilized, or the egg, and then the tassel happens. So if these 2 are not, if this doesn't shake down in time, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get any corn. And so corn would be monoecious, same house, because it's imperfect, does not have the male. The male and the female flower are separate. It is incomplete because it doesn't have all 4 parts: sepal, petal, stamen, carpel / pistil on the same flower. A soybean plant would be monoecious, perfect, and therefore complete. Okay. The factors that affect that flowering are light, and that is going to be long day and short day. So long day plants respond better to shorter nights. Short day plants respond better to longer nights. And then we have day neutral that are not really very dependent upon the light intensity or the duration of that. Maybe the light intensity, but not the duration. So like alfalfa or cotton, tomato is day neutral. However, they are responsive to temperature. And so, as we've talked about growing degree days, that growing degree day is going to influence the growth pattern, and kind of like you can think of growing degree days as the years. So, how long does it take for that plant to reach vegetative state and then move into reproductive phase? Some of them require vernalization, such as apples. So, apples, my uncle has satsuma trees. There needs to be a cold period. Satsumas are like cuties. They're like the little mandarin oranges. So that that tree, that the buds need to go through this cold process in order for them to continue to grow during the next season. All right, back to temperature. If we are starting to have longer periods of warm temperatures and shorter but more intense periods of cold, what do you think will happen to those plants that require vernalization, like a long vernalization period? They're going to struggle to grow. So one of the things that we'll see in the future is plant breeding efforts looking in order to reduce that chilling requirement or that vernalization period. All right, so here's the end. This is the whole life cycle of that flower. Again, I'm setting this up to talk about the potential for uh, genetic variation, germplasm conservation, and then also breeding techniques as we move into module 3. I'll refer back to this in module 3. But so we can see that we have our seed germination. This is kind of where we're at in the germination chamber and the greenhouses out at Shipley. Hopefully we'll get to see to flower and we can see some of these different parts inside of that flower. But the anther will send that pollen grain down the pollen tube and fertilize that egg. And there's a process that goes along in with that. Like there's the science likes to break it down into steps. Once that egg is fertilized, it will begin to develop into a fruit that has a seed.